Have you ever had one of those moments where you walked into something you wish you could unsee? It's like your brain just stops, and all you can do is stand there like an idiot. Yeah, that's exactly how this story begins, except in this case it's not just about what someone saw but what almost happened. So this is about a guy named Ethan, someone I've known for years. Ethan's just your average college kid, the type who plays video games until 3 a.m. but somehow manages to pass his classes. But this isn't really about him. It's about what he stumbled into one day when he decided to skip his afternoon lecture and head home early. Now, Ethan lives in one of those picture-perfect suburban neighborhoods, the kind. The lawns are always mowed, the neighbors smile a little too much, and everyone pretends their lives are flawless. His house was no different. His mom, Karen, was the glue holding it all together. She was the PTA president, soccer mom, and the kind of woman who could whip up a 3-course meal while hosting a charity auction. But Karen wasn't as perfect as she seemed, and Ethan was about to find that out the hard way. It was a sunny afternoon, quiet, almost too quiet. Ethan's dad, Mike, was out of town for a business trip, which wasn't unusual. Mike traveled a lot, and Karen seemed to handle it just fine, or at least that's what everyone thought. Ethan walked through the door, tossed his backpack on the couch, and headed to the kitchen for a snack. That's when he heard it, voices. One of them was his mom's, but the other definitely wasn't his dad's. "Let's do it quickly before Dad gets back," his mom said. Her voice low but filled with something Ethan couldn't quite place, excitement? Guilt? Ethan froze, his heart pounding in his chest as he peeked around the corner. There she was, standing in the living room with him. Who was he? Well, let's just say this wasn't some random delivery guy. It was Dan, their next-door neighbor. You know the type. Tall, charming, with just enough scruff on his jaw to make him look rugged. He was the guy every mom in the neighborhood whispered about, the one who mowed his lawn shirtless and somehow made taking out the trash look like an event. Karen and Dan were standing a little too close, and the air between them was thick with something Ethan didn't want to think about. His mom's laugh, normally so warm and genuine, sounded nervous, almost forced. Ethan ducked back behind the wall, his mind racing. Was he really seeing this? His mom, the woman who made him pancakes every Sunday, standing there with their neighbor, acting like she was about to do something she shouldn't? The voices got quieter, and Ethan knew he had 2 options. Stay hidden and pretend he didn't see anything, or confront them and risk blowing the whole thing wide open. But before he could decide, Karen said something that made his stomach drop. "Dan, we can't do this here. Let's go upstairs." Ethan's heart was in his throat. Upstairs. What the hell was going on? Ethan's feet felt like they were glued to the floor. His brain screamed at him to do something, but his body wouldn't budge. Upstairs. What did she mean by upstairs? He wanted to believe it was just some misunderstanding, but deep down he knew better. That sentence, the tone in her voice, it wasn't innocent. Karen and Dan's footsteps echoed faintly as they climbed the stairs. Ethan's pulse raced. He had never felt so helpless. His mom was sneaking off with their neighbor while his dad was miles away, none the wiser. Ethan debated his next move. He could storm upstairs and confront them, but what would he even say? What if he was wrong and it was just nothing? But no, he wasn't wrong. This wasn't nothing. He crept quietly to the base of the stairs, every step feeling heavier than the last. He could hear their voices drifting down, soft, hushed, but unmistakably intimate. "We shouldn't be doing this," Karen said, though her tone lacked conviction. "You don't mean that," Dan replied. "If you did, you wouldn't have called me." Ethan's stomach twisted. She called him. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment thing. This was planned, deliberate. The sound of a door closing upstairs snapped Ethan out of his daze. He clenched his fists, his mind racing. Should he burst in and stop whatever was about to happen, or should he leave and pretend he never heard or saw anything? But then he thought about his dad. Mike wasn't perfect. No one was. But he loved Karen. He worked hard to give their family a good life. And now here she was, risking it all for what? A fling with the neighbor. Ethan couldn't let this happen. He bolted up the stairs, his footsteps no longer silent. His heart pounded in his ears as he approached the closed bedroom door. He hesitated for a second, his hand hovering over the doorknob. This was it, the moment that would change everything. Before he could open the door, he heard Karen's voice again, this time louder, firmer. "Dan, wait," she said. "We can't, this isn't right." There was a pause, and then Dan spoke, his voice tinged with frustration. "You're the one who invited me over, Karen. Don't back out now." "I know," she said, her voice trembling, "but this would destroy everything. I can't do that to Mike or Ethan." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. She was thinking about them. Maybe it wasn't too late. Ethan's hand hovered over the doorknob, his knuckles white as he gripped it. He wasn't sure what he'd find if he opened that door, but he had to do something. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to intervene before things spiraled out of control. Inside the room, the conversation continued. "Dan, I'm serious. We need to stop this before it's too late," Karen said, her voice shaky but resolute. Dan sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. "You think I don't know that? But Karen, you called me. You're the one who keeps pulling me back. Do you even want me to leave?" Ethan could feel his chest tighten as he listened. Was his mom really caught in this push and pull, unable to make up her mind? And what kind of person was Dan to push her like this, knowing full well the damage it could cause? "I don't know what I want," Karen admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just feel so alone." Dan's tone softened. "You're not alone, Karen. Here, I've always been here." Ethan couldn't take it anymore. He twisted the knob and shoved the door open. The room fell silent in an instant. Karen and Dan were standing near the bed, too close for comfort but not touching. The shock on their faces was unmistakable. "Ethan!" Karen gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Dan stepped back, his expression unreadable, though his body tensed as if preparing for some kind of confrontation. "What the hell is going on?" Ethan demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. He looked at his mom, his eyes wide and searching. Is this what it looks like?" Karen stammered, struggling to find the words. "Ethan, it's not. Don't lie to me," Ethan interrupted, his voice sharp. "I heard everything." Karen's face crumpled, and she sank onto the edge of the bed. "It's not what you think," she said weakly, but even she didn't seem to believe her own words. Dan cleared his throat, taking a step toward the door. "Maybe I should go," he said, avoiding Ethan's gaze. "You think?" Ethan snapped, his glare piercing. "Get out of here before I call the cops or something." Dan hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to argue, but ultimately decided against it. He nodded curtly and slipped past Ethan, disappearing down the stairs. Ethan turned back to his mom, his anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "How could you do this to Dad? To me? To our family?" Karen buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I wasn't going to go through with it," she said, her voice muffled. "I swear, Ethan, I wasn't." "But you almost did." Ethan shot back, his voice rising. "Do you even understand what you've done? What if I hadn't come home? What if—" He stopped, his voice cracking. Karen looked up at him, her eyes red and filled with tears. "I don't have an excuse, Ethan. I just felt so lost, so empty. Your father and we haven't been okay for a long time. But that doesn't mean I don't love him or you." Ethan shook his head, his emotions warring within him. He wanted to believe her, but the betrayal cut too deep. The silence between them stretched thick and suffocating. Ethan's thoughts were a tangled mess. His mind kept replaying the same question over and over. How could she do this? Karen sat there, her eyes downcast, her hands wringing together like they were trying to hold on to something she could no longer control. Ethan couldn't look at her, not the same way. He couldn't erase the image of her and Dan standing so close, her voice low, full of unspoken promises. "I never wanted to hurt you," Karen said softly, almost as if she was speaking to herself. "I didn't want to hurt anyone, least of all you." Ethan turned away, his chest tight. You already did, he thought, but couldn't say. Not yet, not with her sitting there crying in front of him, the woman who'd raised him, who had always been his rock, and now she was this. "You think Dad knows?" Ethan asked after a long pause, the question hanging in the air like a thick fog. Karen flinched at the mention of Mike, her face crumbling further. "No," she whispered. "And I can't let him know. I don't want to destroy everything we've built. And you think this is going to stay a secret?" Ethan's voice was cold, distant. The anger inside him was simmering, threatening to bubble over. "I don't know what to do, Ethan," Karen said, her voice small now. "I was just so lonely. Mike's always gone, and when he's here, he's not really here. I needed someone to, I don't know, be there for me." Ethan felt a sharp pang in his chest. He didn't want to feel sorry for her, not after what she'd done, but he did. He couldn't help it. "You should have talked to me," Ethan muttered. "I don't know, maybe you should have talked to Dad. I mean, I didn't even know this was happening. I had no clue." Karen stood up slowly, wiping her face with the sleeve of her shirt. "I didn't want you to know. I didn't want you to see me like this." She paused, looking at him, her eyes filled with regret. "I thought I could fix things before it got out of hand. But it's too late for that, isn't it?" Ethan didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. What could he say? His mom was a stranger now, a woman who had almost crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and worse, he wasn't sure if he could ever look at her the same way again. The thought of his dad finding out felt like a punch to the gut. What would Dad do if he knew the truth? Would he leave? Would he get angry? Would he blame me for not saying anything? "Do you think Dad would ever forgive you?" Ethan finally asked, his voice quieter now. Karen looked away, her eyes clouded with shame. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't even know if I could forgive myself." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on him. He wanted to say something comforting, something that could make all this go away, but he couldn't. This wasn't something that could be fixed with words. The doorbell rang, breaking the heavy silence. Karen jumped, startled, as if she'd been waiting for something to make this all feel real again. "Who's that?" Ethan asked, his voice sharp. "I don't know," Karen said, looking nervous now. Ethan frowned. "It's not Dad, is it?" Karen swallowed hard. "I don't think so." She walked quickly toward the door, her footsteps echoing through the hallway. Ethan stood frozen, still processing everything he had just heard. Was this the moment his life was about to change forever? Was he about to lose everything? His family, his home, because of his mother's mistake? He took a deep breath and followed her, his heart pounding. Karen stood in the doorway, her hand gripping the frame, her body tense. Ethan stood just behind her, trying to get a glimpse of who was on the other side. But all he could see was the vague silhouette of a person standing there, their figure partially obscured by the porch light. "Who is it?" Ethan asked, his voice low, betraying a flicker of uncertainty. Karen hesitated, her eyes darting toward Ethan as if she was trying to decide what to say. But the hesitation lasted only a second before she forced a smile and opened the door just enough to let the person in. "Oh, it's just Sarah." Ethan blinked. Sarah. What was she doing here? Sarah was a close friend of Karen's, someone who had been a constant presence in their lives, always the life of the party, always there with a laugh, always so easy to talk to. Ethan had always found her to be a bit too chatty, but nothing more than that. "Hey, Karen." "Hey, Ethan." Sarah greeted them with her usual bubbly tone, oblivious to the heavy tension in the room. She stepped inside, casually shrugging off her coat, but the moment she looked at Karen, her smile faltered, just for a second before she caught herself. "Everything okay?" Yeah, Karen quickly replied, though her voice didn't match the words. It was strange, almost as if she was trying to convince herself everything was fine. Ethan raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Something about Sarah's appearance at this exact moment felt off. He glanced at Karen, who seemed more on edge than usual, like she was trying to hide something big. And that's when the question hit him. Why was Sarah here? Ethan cleared his throat. What's going on, Mom? Karen's eyes widened, caught off guard by the directness of his question. Sarah, however, didn't seem to notice the change in atmosphere. She shrugged casually, looking from one to the other. Just catching up with Karen, Sarah said, her voice full of innocence, though Ethan could see the faint flicker of something in her eyes. Was she hiding something too? Karen gave Sarah a pointed look, as though trying to tell her to tone it down, but Sarah just shrugged it off. Then, turning to Ethan, she flashed a bright smile. Don't worry, nothing bad. Just a little girls' talk. Girls' talk. Ethan felt his skin crawl. He didn't like the sound of that at all. This wasn't some innocent catch-up. No one came over for girls' talk when things were fine. Is that all? Ethan asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. Karen gave him a sharp look, warning him to back off. Ethan, maybe you should go upstairs for a bit. He wasn't having it, not anymore. He'd been patient for so long, letting everything slide, but not this time. No, Ethan said, his voice rising. I'm not going anywhere until I know what's going on. Frustration and confusion swirled inside him. Karen's expression hardened, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. Ethan, she said, her voice a little too controlled. It's not your business right now. Just go to your room. Before Ethan could argue, Sarah stepped forward, her tone suddenly turning serious. Too serious. Ethan, we're not hiding anything. Don't make a bigger deal out of this than it already is. It was like someone had flipped a switch. Sarah, the person who always laughed and cracked jokes, was now calm, almost too calm. There was something in the air that didn't sit right. Ethan frowned. You're not making sense, and neither is Mom. First she's in there with Dan. Enough. Karen snapped, her voice suddenly sharp. We can't do this right now. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The air grew thick with tension, and for the first time, Ethan saw his mom's veneer crack just enough to show him that there was so much more happening than she was letting on. Then Sarah interjected, her eyes narrowing slightly. What does he have to do with anything? Ethan froze. He could have sworn Sarah knew exactly what he was talking about. Why else would she suddenly sound defensive? Ethan began, but the words caught in his throat. Was it possible? Was Sarah involved in this too? Was she in on it? Karen's eyes darted between Sarah and Ethan, and for a brief moment, Ethan saw a look of fear pass between them. It was like a silent understanding, a code that had been broken, a thread that had been tugged too far. He took a deep breath, his heart racing. What are you hiding, Mom? What is going on? There it was. That was the moment when everything was about to unravel. Karen took a step back, her eyes wide and panicked. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say anything, the front door slammed open with force. Ethan's blood ran cold. His dad, the man who had been gone all week for work, the man who had no idea that his entire world was about to come crashing down, stood there, suitcase in hand. His face fell as he saw the scene in front of him. Ethan standing by the door with a look of disbelief. Karen frozen, her face pale. Sarah looking guilty in the background. The air felt like it was sucked out of the room as Mike's eyes narrowed, taking in the situation. Karen, what's going on here? Mike stood in the doorway. His brow furrowed as he took in the tension that filled the room. He wasn't stupid. He could feel it in the air, the unspoken truth hanging around them like a dark cloud. Karen, what's going on? Mike asked again, his voice calm but firm. Karen froze, her mouth moving as if trying to form words but finding none. She looked at Sarah, who had taken a few steps back, her eyes wide with the same unspoken fear that was now written all over Karen's face. Ethan stood there, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure if this was a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe Mike could help. Maybe he could stop the damage. But there was no pretending anymore. The lies had been building up, and now they had to come crashing down. Karen began, but Mike cut her off, his tone suddenly more serious. I'm talking to you, Karen, Mike said, stepping further into the room, his suitcase abandoned by the door. What's going on here? You look like you've seen a ghost. Ethan took a step forward. He couldn't hold back any longer. The words burst from him, raw and unfiltered. Dad, Mom almost. She almost had an affair with Dad. Mike blinked, the words hitting him like a slap in the face. His eyes flicked between Karen and Ethan, the shock evident on his face. For a moment it felt like time stopped. What? Mike whispered. Karen crumpled, the weight of Ethan's accusation crashing down on her. She sank into a chair, her face pale, her hands trembling. Ethan, I didn't want you to know. I didn't want anyone to know, she said, her voice shaking. But it wasn't what you think. Then what was it? Mike's voice was barely a whisper, like the wind had been knocked out of him. He stared at Karen, searching her face for any sign of the woman he thought he knew, the woman he married all those years ago. Karen looked at Sarah, who stood there still frozen in place, avoiding Mike's eyes. Sarah, please, you should go. Sarah hesitated, her lips trembling before nodding reluctantly. I think it's time for me to leave. She turned to Ethan, her face etched with guilt. Ethan, I never meant for things to get this messy. Ethan watched as Sarah left, her exit leaving a cold silence behind her. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Everything was too overwhelming. His mother, his father, everything was shifting, falling apart. Mike closed the distance between him and Karen, his gaze steady, but there was a hint of something in his eyes. Disappointment, hurt, maybe both. Karen, I don't understand. Why didn't you tell me? Why go this far? Karen's tears began to fall, slowly at first, then in heavy streams. I don't know. I was so lonely, Mike. You've been gone so much, and when you're here, you're not really here. I needed someone. Dan was there. Mike shook his head, the words cutting deep. So you thought betraying me would fix that? You thought I wouldn't notice? I just go along with it. His voice cracked with emotion, the anger and the hurt finally breaking free. Ethan stood back, his chest tight, watching as his parents faced off, the reality of everything sinking in. This wasn't just about Dan anymore. This was about everything, about years of silence, about a marriage that was starting to feel like it was on life support. Karen tried to reach out for Mike's hand, but he pulled away, a sharp movement that made Ethan's heart skip a beat. Mike, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I don't know what came over me. I just needed to feel wanted, to feel alive again. Mike didn't respond immediately. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, then glanced at Ethan, who was still standing by the wall, feeling like a stranger in his own home. Ethan, I never wanted this, Karen said, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan didn't know what to say. He couldn't forgive her. Not right now, not when everything felt so raw. But he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't going to be something they just forgot. Not ever. Mike finally spoke, his voice low but clear. We need to talk. The three of us. Now.